When reflecting on the horrors of World War II, the focus of attention is often directed towards Nazi Germany and the multiple genocides it carried out. While that cruelty hardly finds equivalents, the truth is that they were not the only Axis country committing degrading actions under the justification of being at war. Japan, the last rival of the Allies to surrender, has a long record of atrocities committed in the Pacific, many of which have been buried by history due to distance, xenophobia towards Asian victims, or simply because forgetfulness seems to be a Japanese state policy. That's why, in this new video on military history, we want to review some of the darkest pages of Japanese history. Get ready to see and hear about the most violent atrocities carried out during World War II. As always, we recommend discretion, as we will be discussing truly shocking cases. Now let's begin. Before delving into these tragic events, it is useful to provide a brief definition of what a war crime is. These have been defined as violations of the laws or customs of war, including attacks against civilians and unarmed combatants. Essentially, engaging in genocidal, degrading, or excessive aggressions under the pretext of being in combat. One of the significant documents in this regard is the Geneva Conventions of 1864, which anticipated the definition of these crimes. It is there that we can trace a fateful line with what happened in World War II. The Japanese Empire was not a signatory to these conventions. Now, let's specifically talk about the type of horrors we are discussing. Many of the most serious Japanese crimes were carried out in Chinese territory, as since 1937, the Japanese Empire was in a bloody war with its continental neighbor. It was in that same year that imperial troops managed to conquer the city of Nanking on December 13th. In an act of cowardice, the governors and commanders of the Chinese Nationalist Army abandoned the city before the enemy's entry, leaving behind thousands of trapped soldiers and civilians in the walled city. They were thus at the mercy of an army that hated them, not only as military rivals, but also sought to exterminate them on racist grounds. It is worth remembering that for Japan, China was the scourge of Asia and had to be eliminated for Japanese culture to flourish. Such hatred can only be translated into genocide. The Nanking Massacre occurred over a 6-week period following the occupation of the city in the early days of January 1938. First, the invaders set about destroying homes and stealing any material possessions they found in their path. Once this first step, which involved leaving hundreds of thousands of Chinese homeless and defenseless, was completed, what followed was a hellish scenario quite similar to what happened in German extermination camps. Mass rapes of women, the execution of civilians, the stacking of prisoners of war turned into slaves, and, of course, the display of victims in public spaces as a method of intimidation. The following images were filmed by an American pastor in 1937, and they are among the few records of the brutality that occurred in the Chinese cities. They seem like scenes taken from the Holocaust. It is estimated that between 40,000 and 300,000 Chinese died in a span of 40 days. In the worst-case scenario, this equates to almost 7,500 deaths per day, with open graves and the blood that such a figure implies. What happened in those 6 weeks left indelible images of unprecedented brutality. There are photos of soldiers impaling babies with their bayonets. That kind of material is available in research archives. For obvious reasons, we cannot show such images. Earlier, we compared what happened in Nanking to the Nazi genocides, but there is something in which they differ. The Japanese crime remains without legal or social condemnation. In 1946, the Tokyo War Tribunal sentenced Army Commander Iwani Matsui to death, but one guilty party is not enough to explain such barbarity. To this day, the actions carried out by Japanese soldiers in Nanking remain a topic of debate and controversy, and pose an obstacle to Japan's diplomatic relations not only with China, but also with other Asian nations, such as South Korea. Executions and rapes were not the only forms of torture by the Japanese Empire. As a good pupil of the Third Reich, they established scientific research centers where human prisoners were used as guinea pigs for all kinds of experiments. It is time to meet the infamous Unit 731, which carried out an impressive biological weapons development program, but at a very high human cost. Unit 731 was disguised as a water purification team located in the Pingfang district, northeast of the Chinese city of Harbin, situated within the conquered territory of Manchukuo. Its raison d'etre was far from that humanistic purpose. It was essentially the Japanese SS, responsible for political propaganda as a strongly ideological emblem related to Kodowa, or the War Party. Initially, it acted solely against communist propaganda but expanded its responsibilities in other directions, promoting the belief in Japanese racial supremacy, racist theories, counterespionage, research, political sabotage, and infiltration behind enemy lines. For this purpose, a complex was built spanning 6 square kilometers, consisting of about 150 buildings, including prisons, laboratories, factories, and warehouses equipped with boilers to produce all kinds of chemical agents. These staggering figures demonstrate that the Japanese bacteriological program was the most ambitious among all war contenders. No one, like Imperial Japan, went as far when it came to applying such weapons. It was in this context that Unit 731 was responsible for numerous military development projects, including the creation of special munitions, pathogenic agents for offensive purposes, and all kinds of biological weapons. From 1937, a special medical project with the code name Maruta began, in which humans were used for experiments. Test subjects were abducted from the surrounding population, referred to as Marutas, meaning logs. In this way, Japanese torturers made it clear that their victims were like inanimate objects available for any kind of experiment. Besides adult men and women, there were children, the elderly, and pregnant women. Many years later, a soldier from Unit 731 apologized to the Chinese people.
中国の人たちには謝りたいことが主なんですよ。本当のことを言って、こんな惨めなことをやってね、本当に終戦の時に日本のね、子供たちを見てくれて、慕ってくれたっていうことは本当に私感謝しますし。
Beyond the sincerity in this man's words, the crimes of his unit were repugnant. Plus, among the most frequent operations were vivisections, i.e. the dissection of living subjects. The incredible aspect is that these were carried out without the use of anesthesia on the victims. So the Marutas were fully conscious when they felt the cold scalpels of Unit 731 on their skin. It is impossible to imagine the pain and desperation experienced in the Harbin facilities. It is estimated that around 10,000 people of Chinese, Korean, Mongolian, and Russian origin were subjected to military experimentation, although calculations are confusing and difficult to carry out due to the lack of documentation on these illegal and inhumane procedures. In the experimentation rooms, prisoners were injected with powerful pathogens at the same time to investigate the repercussions of untreated sexually transmitted diseases. Male and female prisoners were deliberately infected with syphilis and gonorrhea through systematic rape. One of the most particular cases was the interaction of prisoners with fleas transmitting the bubonic plague, to analyze the feasibility of biological warfare. Of course, the human cost was enormous, and the vast majority of the study subjects died painfully. You might think that, given the cruelty demonstrated by these scientists, the judicial process was equally relentless. That was not the case. Quite the opposite happened. Many of the specialist torturers continued their careers in politics, education, business, and medicine. A few were arrested by Soviet forces and prosecuted in the Jaborovsk war crimes trials. Due to their brutality, the actions of Unit 731 have been denounced by the United Nations today as war crimes. The violence of Imperial Japan was not limited to the conquered regions in China, but also reached the inhabitants of multiple countries in the region, with South Korea being one of the most affected. In other videos on this same channel, we have talked about the critical situation of prostitution during World War II. In various parts of Europe, there was a massive phenomenon of the appearance of brothels, both private and military. In the latter, many of the prostitutes were little more than slaves, forcibly recruited by Axis invaders. Something similar happened in Asia. With the promise of a better life, the Imperial Japanese Army recruited women, mainly Chinese and Koreans, promising them work and well-being. But these were empty words. The girls were turned into sex slaves who served the Japanese soldiers during their military advance. This practice reached unimaginable numbers during World War II, with most of the hostages dying in sordid brothels after suffering all kinds of abuses at the hands of their captors. But what motivated Japan to commit such a gruesome war crime? Once again, we must consider the belief in racial superiority on the part of the island. In the mind of the Japanese soldier, the inhabitants of other Asian nations were subhumans who needed to be controlled and, in the worst cases, eliminated. At the same time, it was considered necessary to pay attention to the sexual behaviors of the troops to prevent homosexual tendencies after long combat days. This logic is quite similar to that applied by the Third Reich when installing military brothels in Poland and France. This hell was so systematized that the women chosen by Japan's occupying forces received a particular name, Ianfu, a word that means comfort women. Thousands of girls from Korea, China, and even small Japanese villages were forced to satisfy the sexual impulses of imperial soldiers during the conflict, and that included truly violent practices, beatings, and all kinds of perversions. What you will see next is a unique and shocking archive, recorded by Chinese soldiers who rescued a group of Korean comfort women in September 1944. The vacant gazes and battered bodies tell a cruel story. The lack of official documents has made it difficult to estimate the total number of comfort women, as a considerable amount of material related to war crimes and the responsibility of the nation's top leaders were destroyed by government order. Historians have arrived at various estimates by reviewing documentation indicating the ratio of soldiers to the number of women in a specific area. Historian Yoshiaki Yoshimi, who led the first academic study on this topic, gave an estimate of between 50,000 and 200,000 victims. Over time, these figures gained more support, although it is also known that multiple cases were never reported or recorded due to the fear of women being scorned upon returning home. Some Chinese researchers propose a figure close to 300,000 comfort women abducted by the Japanese Empire. Simultaneously with the establishment of militarized brothels, Japanese troops also built camps to house prisoners of war captured during the conflict. While no captive fared well in the hands of the enemy, at the time of Japan's surrender in 1945, the testimonies and situation of those who had been subjected in these facilities provided a new perspective on the brutality that occurred in Asia. In the survivors' accounts, the figure of Buntai Joe stands out, the name assigned to the camp supervisors and the rest of the captors. The treatment they gave to the prisoner consisted of beatings, limb amputations, starvation, and lack of medical supplies, resulting in massive mortality. Abuses such as those previously described were part of the daily life of all those who ended up in the coal mines of Baron Mitsui. or any of the factories scattered across Japan. Forced labor was not only a production tool, but also a means of elimination. The prisoners' bodies were pushed to the limits of their capacities, enduring all kinds of tortures that usually ended in death. Among all the tortures suffered by Allied prisoners at the hands of the Japanese, one of the most well-known and widespread was the death marches. Long walks under the sun, without any kind of food or hydration, during which thousands of inmates died. In April 1942, around 76,000 prisoners of war and civilians of Filipino and American origin marched at gunpoint from the southern tip of the Bataan Peninsula to a prisoner camp located 101 kilometers away. This torture was characterized by a series of physical abuses and massacres that resulted in the death of several thousand prisoners, so that once World War II ended, the events in Bataan were classified as a war crime by the Allied Military Commission. The United States used information about this march in 1944 to foster social hatred toward Japan and lay the groundwork for the bombings in 1945. From Washington, they already anticipated that the Japanese Empire would be the last bastion of the Axis to fall. Unlike other atrocities discussed in this video, the Japanese authorities who carried out the Bataan March were prosecuted and executed between 1946 and 1948. This included Generals Hideki Tojo, Kenji Doihara, Seishiro Itagaki, Heitaro Kimura Iwane Matsui, and Baron Koki Hirota. In these images, we can see the judicial processes that put the culprits behind bars or with the noose around their necks. It may sound like a cliché phrase, but war is truly hell, and during the 1940s, practically all fronts in conflict witnessed war crimes. The significant difference in the Japanese case is that many of those responsible were never prosecuted. In fact, several generals and politicians from the imperial era continued their careers during the island's transition to the liberal and capitalist democracy it is today. This lack of justice and memory causes the wounds in Asia to still not have fully healed. From history, it is necessary to always keep these events in mind. So we reach the end of this episode. If you want to continue discovering dark events that occurred during World War II, we invite you to subscribe and activate notifications. For now, we bid farewell until the next installment of Military History.